What was your role at Fisher Library and what was your day-to-day work actually like?
It was always exciting. I was like a human Google.
There's a photo of him somewhere.
Really? Where?
3 along from the ladder. And Mays Crescent, for those of you who know the university, is named after him.
Matt, do you recognise the architects in this?
Yeah, we did that earlier.
This is a truly historic photograph.
I think Melbourne Uni beats University of Sydney for student services just by a few weeks or so.
Clad with copper, and for the first couple of years it was really bright copper. In fact, Oniswar called it the largest Benson and Hedges packaging.
Yeah, and it was a time when it was an attempt to be as modern as possible.
And the sight of Fisher undergraduate at night is just magnificent.
It's a bit confusing because it's Yulia Ulyannikova.
That's what it just is, yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Philip Kent, and I'm honoured to be the University Librarian here at the University of Sydney. Welcome to the library and our celebrations for the 60th anniversary of this famous building. I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and the communities of the Gadi people for their care of the land where we meet today. For tens of thousands of years, they have shared and exchanged knowledges for the benefit of all. My brief role is to introduce our panel moderator, Professor Emeritus Margaret Harris, and then the show will be hers to manage and to introduce the proceedings for the rest of this session. I can think of no one better than Margaret to be the anchor for this session. In addition to her long-standing and esteemed membership of the university community, Margaret's association with the library extends from her first year as an undergraduate. Am I allowed to say what year, Margaret? In 1959, to her current role as a member of the Friends of the Library Committee. So Margaret has known the library since it was resident in the old Fisher Library, now Maclaurin Hall, where her portrait hangs on the wall. Following her arts degree at Sydney, Margaret commenced as a teaching fellow in 1964. Then she disappeared to the University of London to complete her PhD, returning in 1969 to take up her lectureship and becoming Professor of English Literature in 1994. Margaret is an expert in Victorian and Australian literature. She was a skilled university administrator, senior administrator, and an elected member of the University Senate for 10 years, over 10 years. Her huge contribution to this university was recognised in 2022 through Margaret's submission to the degree of Doctor of Letters honoris causa. So as moderator today, Margaret continues a long history of contributing to the library and our events and activities. The Fisher Library Centenary book includes a photo of Margaret speaking at the opening of an exhibition curated by her in 2009. And that just says so much about Margaret and her relationship with us. Friends and colleagues, please welcome Professor Emerita Margaret Harris.
Thanks very much, Philip. That was a very generous and extensive introduction, for which I thank you. I must, however, point out that there was one omission, because I share this 60th anniversary. 1963 was my first postgraduate year, and so I feel a particular affinity with this anniversary of the library. It's never felt quite right to be in the library with shoes on after a particular year of introduction. So today we have a panel of 4, and we have, yes. We have words and music. So let us begin. I'll introduce the speakers, perhaps as I put a question to each of them rather than going through an introduction for all 4. And I'll begin with Dr. Yulia Ulyannikova, who's an academic librarian from the library, and she's been researching the history associated with the current Fisher Library. Yulia has a PhD in history from the University of Melbourne. She's authored and co-authored several papers that range from medical research methods to information mapping and service delivery in a library environment. Her special interests are systematic review support and service improvement with an emphasis on education and mentorship. So the first question that I'll put to Yulia is, why did Sydney University need a new library?
Well, as we all know, this new building, as we call it, New Fisher Building, wasn't the first library that the university had. First library was completed in 1909. And at that time, it seated 250 students, and it had, which interestingly was almost 25% of all enrollment in the university. And it had capacity to hold 250,000 books, which was 5 times more than the library then had. So it was pretty sufficient for 1909. And it was also an interesting building in the sense that it was, as I've learned recently, the only specialized library building among all the universities in Australia. The other universities didn't have specialized buildings for libraries. So it was a big achievement for the time. But then after the Second World War, the situation started changing. So by the mid-50s, there were already 8,000 enrollments, and there were 360,000 more volumes in the library. So the library holdings expanded, the enrollment expanded, and the library, as we all know, in current McLaurin Hall hasn't. It has limited capacity to seat people and hold books. So this space was a crucial element in the university realizing that they need a new building. There was also the context to it that all over the world, and all over the world where Australia was looking for direction, meaning the UK, they were looking to increase investment into the universities. And in 1958, the government of the United Kingdom started investing, it was a staggered investment, £84 million into the universities in Britain, because they anticipated that by mid-60s, there will be 30,000 more students enrolled in British universities. And funny enough, at the same time, in Australia, they realized that the increase in Australian enrollments will be the same, 30,000 students. And given the disparity in population, increase in Australia was actually much larger per capita than in the UK. So there was this increased push for higher education from the new demographic, the baby boomers, the population that was rising after the Second World War. And the demand for space was overwhelming. And there are stories, I was reading Oniswa, there are stories in Oniswa in 1950s, a lot of stories where outraged students are complaining about how inadequate the Fisher Library is in terms of space. The overflow of students, about 100 of them, were a constant residence in the public library, and the researchers there were complaining. Students were hiding books because there were not enough books. They were hiding them in stacks, and librarians would go on regular fishing grounds to fish them out of the stacks, and it was in their hundreds that they did it. So the pressure was immense. The university realized that, and by mid-50s there was a clear decision that a new library is needed. And I think that I can basically outline very quickly what the new library was thought to be, what kind of numbers was thought to be relevant at that time. So in 1957, they thought that a library for 2,000 spaces, study spaces, and 1 million books would be an adequate arrangement for the university. So the new Fisher Library in projects was just that: 2,000 spaces, reading spaces, sitting spaces, and 1 million books. It has to be a central location, so they wanted it to be accessible for all students at the university. It had to cater for different type of readers, undergrads as well as researchers. And they chose this location because it's in a dip. And they thought that this way they could actually create a taller building, which will not overshadow Great Hall opposite. So it had to take into consideration the environment in which it was sitting, and this location was actually ticking all the boxes. But that will come later.
Thank you. Let's go then to Matt. I'll give the question first so you can think about it while I tell about your doings and achievements. Basically, can you please talk a bit about who the Fisher architects were, and in particular, perhaps could you talk about the role of the government architect? Now, Matt Devine is a registered architect with a passion for architecture design, community, history, and travel. He studied architecture and heritage conservation at the University of Sydney and has worked across a wide spectrum of the architecture and heritage conservation industries in Sydney, Australia. As a result, he has a broad understanding of Australian architecture and architectural history, and especially the past, current, and future development of Sydney. He's been researching E.H. Farmer, the New South Wales government architect who oversaw the building of Fisher Library, though the real work was done by Ken Woolley and Tom O'Mahony. Now, this may, to some extent, be a teaser for what you're going to say. Thanks, Matt.
So thank you. I was very fortunate a few years ago to get a fellowship at the State Library, where I was researching the personal papers of Ted Farmer, Edward Herbert Farmer, known as Ted, and he was the government architect from 1958 to 1973. And just some background on what the government architect is. Soon after Lachlan Macquarie arrived in the colony, he had very grand plans for establishment of a series of important buildings, and realized that he needed an architect to support him. And he realized that there was a convict known as Francis Greenway, and in 1816, Francis Greenway was appointed civil architect and engineer by Lachlan Macquarie. And from that date, there has always been an architect employed by the state government with varying degrees of responsibility. From during the sort of 50s to 80s was probably the largest that the government architects branch or government architects office ever got. I think it had up to 1,500 staff at one point. And as I said, the government architect as a role still exists today. We have our first female government architect. Her name is Abby Galvin, and she's been government architect since about 2020. And that office is now about 20 staff. I was fortunate to work in the government architect's office. for about 12 years until 2016, which happened to be the 200th anniversary of that office. For a long time, less so now, for a long time, the role of the government architect was essentially to give advice to the government for any projects they were proposing, as well as design and documentation of those projects. Often in collaboration with other architects, not necessarily though. Sometimes the initial, particularly during the busiest period, the government architect's office would often do the initial scheme and then give it to another firm to document. And that was particularly during the sort of 50s to 70s, when there was an immense number of schools, hospitals, police stations, jails, courthouses, university buildings, anyway, sort of all sorts of government buildings. In this instance, with the design of this building, it's slightly different to some of the other government buildings that were being done at the time. In a lot of instances, someone in the government architect's branch would come up with a scheme and then give it to another firm of architects to document, because there was just so much happening they couldn't document them all themselves. If it was something particularly specialized, like a hospital, there were separate hospital sections of the government architect's branch. But unusual things like university libraries were sort of often part of a special projects team. In this case, there were two architects appointed. There was a private firm, TE Omani Architects, and to work in association with the government architects branch. And from the government architects branch, it was the particular architect involved was a very young architect called Ken Woolley. He was part of a group of young outstanding architects who were given a lot of opportunity. They were basically given all of the really exceptional things, and they had this separate group called the design room. So they didn't really do the hospitals, the schools, unless they were coming up with a new prototype or something like that. Slightly strange in that the architects Omani and Woolley were both originally intended as an architect. Omani had done a few other projects for the government architects branch under the previous government architect, Cobden Parks, where he had actually done the whole thing, designed it, and then did all the documentation. But that seemed fairly unusual at the time. In this instance, they were both approached to work in association. It took a little bit of time to work out what was going to happen, because the final brief wasn't resolved for a few years. So they were initially approached in 57. The brief wasn't resolved until, when did Osborne arrive? 58. So they didn't really know exactly what it was going to be. Osborne's brief was that there would be the two separate parts of the library, and Woolley and Omani both presented options, and then that went to the university for a review, and Omani's option was a preferred option. Then Woolley went back and finessed that, and so Omani's option was a low undergraduate and then a taller postgraduate research wing. Ken Woolley's version of that was the introduction of a building in between, which would have essentially be an entrance with a atrium sort of dividing the two separate areas. Omani's firm then documented it, and then once documentation was complete, that was then given to Public Works, and the government architect was part of Public Works, who was then involved in managing construction. Of course, there was only the undergraduate and the entrance building that was completed. During construction, Ken Woolley was involved in designing some additional specific elements such as handrails and choosing finishes. But there was always some... Omani in later years was particularly upset that he wasn't ever properly attributed as a major part of the design of the project. This really came about in the 1980s as Ken Woolley's career progression rapidly rose and became one of Australia's most successful late 20th century architects. Omani has still had a very successful career, but in a lot of publications from about the 80s and 90s, Omani's name seemed to slip off the information as who was the architect for the building. When the project was finished, it won multiple awards. The Sulman Award, which at the time was the highest architecture award in New South Wales. Also the Royal Institute of British Architects Gold Medal, which was given to international projects. It won that as well. And at the time it was, I'm trying to remember who came first, probably E.H. Farmer, government architect in association with T.A. Omani, was usually attributed as the authors. And then sometimes later on they would say project architect Ken Woolley. And then that's when the fact that Omani's name seemed to disappear from the story. And Omani wrote a lot about that himself in the 1980s and 1990s, trying to prove that he was very involved. As I said, I think it's partly because Ken Woolley became so successful and so noted that that's possibly why Omani's name sort of slipped off. Sorry, that was a very long answer. I'm sorry about that. A lot to say.
And we thought we were sitting in a calm and tranquil building.
Oh no. Architects are never calm.
Thanks very much, Matt. Our next speaker is Sebastian Boell. Here he is. An academic in the Sydney Business School who specialises in the history of information technology. And he investigates how information and communication technologies shape the ways organisations are able to create understanding about themselves and their environment. Seeing organisations as complex, continuously changing social systems, Sebastian explores foundational questions about information systems. So with that biographical information, it won't surprise you to learn that what I want to ask Sebastian to talk about initially is how did technology define the library organisation in the 1950s and 1960s? Sebastian.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's take us back to what technology looked like in the early 60s. And there's lists of all the computers that were used in Australia in 1960s, early 1960s. That's government, that's organizations, that's universities, and it's a countable number. Presumably, we all have a computer on us today that surpasses the combined power of all these computers installed in Australia in the early 60s. So now when we say what is the role of technology, computers had a big influence on how the university changed or university library changed at the time. In the early 60s, there was no computer used in the university. Everything was a manual process. Forms, people were filling out forms. There was not even mechanical data processing, nothing like that. So the role of technologies in the 60s was really transforming how the library was operating. We heard from Yulia, there's big influence of more and more students coming into the library. So now, how do you keep track of all the books and where they are at a point in time from going from paper forms? You had to use technology to cope with the amount of increased loans, but also the increased amount of books that you're taking into the library. We heard 250,000 books was intended for the old Fisher Library, 1 million. I think by the end of the 60s, the 1 million was already reached. So the intake of books was huge, and you need to keep pace with that. So technology played a big role in cataloging. So there was the emerging MARC standard in the US, and that promised that University of Sydney doesn't have to catalog every book that's coming into the library. Instead, the university could rely on work done by others and then copy that work in order to keep up with the pace of books that are coming into the library. So we see changes to how cataloging was organized in the library that was then reflected also in the library structure. So you have copy cataloging as a new department that wasn't there before, because now you have much more copy catalogs. Cataloging was done then in the late 60s, a little bit on computers for the undergraduate library, but by the early 70s, all of the intake was done, put into a computer. So because the computer could print all these little cards that people used to search for books for, they could print them in the order they needed to be put and sorted into the shelves. It was a huge amount of staff that was involved running around putting these cards in all the drawers. If you print them out, thousands of cards every week you had thousands of cards that needed to be sorted, and they were already printed in the right order. So I think the biggest change that we saw was that there was a new type of librarian coming into the library, the systems librarian. And then the systems library department that was established in the library. So the biggest change, I would say, in the 60s that we see compared to the 50s is that we see new departments and new kinds of work that the library engaged in.
Thank you. There was still the need for people, and next speaker is Katie Blake.
There's still a need for people.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Philip's a person. There are other librarians here, I know. I don't think any robots are about to stand up and claim. So Katie was Fisher Reference Librarian 1970 to 79, and her career followed the development of digital information services serving academic and special libraries from online through CD-ROM to web. After 9 years at Fisher, she was a trainer and representative for a series of international online information services. For several years, she was a partner in an independent information consultancy, and her last role in the library world was with a consortium of universities developing repositories for research data. Now retired, she's a chorister with Sydney Philharmonia Choirs, and she still enjoys designing catalogues and lending systems. So this question asks itself really, Katie, what was your role at Fisher Library, and what was your day-to-day work actually like?
It was always exciting. When I joined the library in 1970, I was a general library assistant, and I think I had my degree and a diploma of librarianship, and I'd worked for a year as a school librarian, gone overseas, came back looking for a job. I probably found an ad printed in the Sydney Morning Herald, which is how one found jobs in those days. And I applied for it, and I got the role of general library assistant in the circulation department. I'd never seen such a big library. I was fairly shy Northern Beaches girl, and it was a huge library and still is, and it was enormously fun to work in. As a circulation librarian, well, I wasn't the circulation librarian, I was a lowly assistant. We were rostered on the horseshoe desk, which was, we'd come in the right-hand side of the library door, and the horseshoe desk was right there. And so we'd be rostered on that desk to stamp out the books, and people would arrive with armfuls of books to borrow them, and we would stamp them with this great big metal stamp and put a transaction card in the slip, in the pocket in the back of the book. And people are nodding, people all remember that as it goes on. What I can't remember is whether they, Pauline, you might remember, whether they filled out big, tall loan cards. Yes. They did. And I think they were green for research and yellow for undergraduate. Thank God my memory's still. Now, the trick of this was to get the stamp equal the same number
Yes.
on both the transaction cards in the book and on the big card. And that was sometimes a little bit stressful, particularly late at night, because there were people who specialised in coming to the circulation desk with piles and piles of books at 5 minutes before closing time. There was always a shelver on the door that would check books as they were going out, and sometimes that shelver would be deployed to run after a student or a member of staff when the numbers got out of sync, because they sometimes did. Those stamps might get caught, or they might run out of ink. But yes, sometimes we had to say, come back, and we had to shuffle those cards around and get them done. We also used to fine people for bringing books back late. And so we were involved in fining people when they came back. And one of my sad stories was a nun who came up to the circulation desk. And I was pretty strict. I've always been pretty severe. And this nun had taken a vow of poverty. Of course, she didn't have any money. And I said, I'm sorry, but you've got to pay the fine. And anyway, she asked to speak to the manager, my boss, Gwen Tucker, now Gwen Rafferty, and Gwen let her off. And so she had taken a vow of poverty. She ended up having them. So I knew that the rules could be bent occasionally. Behind my desk in the circulation department was the machine room, and it was an enormous room full of these machines, like something out of Heath Robinson, shuffling the cards around to manage the library loans and the overdues. It was a noisy room, but you couldn't hear much when you shut the door. And there were special people in there that we weren't allowed to touch the cards because it was a highly specialised job. So after about a year or a year and a half or so of being a circulation librarian, I applied for a job in the research library, the reference department under Margaret Lundy. And I got a job as an assistant librarian. I can't remember whether it was 2 or 1, which was the lowest. But anyway, I was a new social sciences librarian, and I got to sit on the reference desk. And that was probably the most exciting job I've ever had. One would be rostered on the reference desk, and you were there, trapped. You had to stay there, and people could come and ask you anything. I was like a human Google, and there was no other place to ask for information. People could come and ask you anything, or they could come and ring you. They could ring you up, and we were told we had to answer real people first, not the telephones. So sometimes the telephone would ring for a long time. It's always interesting to hear people say, oh, don't worry about me, answer the phone, as though the phone took priority. So no, people took priority. We would teach them how to use the catalogue. So people would say, I can't find this. We'd take them up to the catalogue and say, this is how you look up the catalogue, which was still a card catalogue when I left. Anything people asked, we would check the reference collection if they were interested in psychology or economics or science. There was a reference collection full of indexes and abstracts, printed indexes and abstracts to the journal literature. And so you teach people how to find journal publications in chemical abstracts, or how to look up the citation indexes. And they were big, they were heavy, it was very physical. You would be walking around, lifting the books up, putting them on the shelves, going up to the catalogue and so forth. I remember being on the reference desk was always fun because you were always surrounded by people. Libraries are quite quiet in comparison to the people that were around in those days. And there was always a little cluster of young men around my desk. And I remember my boss saying one time, do you remember Helen Bate? She said, it must be nice having multiple admirers because they can talk to each other when you're busy. Thank you, Helen. We also did a lot of reader education. So we'd liaise with the academic staff to teach their students how to use the indexes and abstracts for the journal literature, how to use the library. And so we design little manuals and run training courses for the students. And so we'd write them out and hand that list to the typist. Miss Lundy's typist would type up these, and they must have been roneoed off, or maybe photocopying.
I reckon Gestetner.
You reckon Gestetner? I reckon Gestetner too. So rodeos weren't the same things as Gestetners, were they? I think they're slightly different.
Well, this is a
Smelled better.
That smell of the perfect. Yeah. And so we'd run hour-long training courses for the students in various disciplines, like the government department or economics or English or what have you. And that was always fun to teach people. And I think one of the most rewarding things that ever happened to me was doing a course teaching people how to use, I don't know what, psychological abstracts. And they went and they looked at me and said, "Do these exist for other subjects too?" It was during those years that we started to become involved with computerization, online searching. And so we started, I have many stories to tell, which I probably don't have time for today, about the first time we started using punched cards that we would code and send to the National Library to be run against Index Medicus, which is now Medline, and how they became available online, and those very first early days of doing online searches for academic staff were the most exciting times of my life, I suppose. Thank you. That's what a day in Fisher would never dull.
So we'll come back to Yulia and ask if you could tell us, please, who was involved from the university side in the planning and design of the new library, and what contribution did those worthies make?
Probably before I start talking about personalities, I'll just very briefly describe how the decision was made and where the money came from, because there's a bit of a story around that as well. So the university realized that they need a new library pretty early. Already in 1953, when they started creating a plan for the next decade, 54 to 64, the library became very top priority on their list of things to build and create. So it's quite an early realization. And the price tag appeared at approximately the same time. So it was £1 million. And when I first saw the price tag, I thought it was an enormous amount of money. Until you actually look at the list, what they wanted to build in that decade. And one of them was a new medical school. Another one was new chemistry school building. And for chemistry school building, the price tag was £1 million. For the new graduate school for medicine, it was £2 million. So it's quite a standard amount of money for a university building by the looks of it. So, of course, £1 million was for stage one, which is one building, and then 1.3 for another building. So it actually all came down to £2.3 million. But again, within the currency of the day and within the context of the day, this is pretty standard. But it's a huge amount of money anyway. So when they were planning for the next decade, 54 to 64, they were planning quite a significant expansion in land for the university as well. At that point, the university was sitting on 81 acres, minus colleges, and they were planning to expand to 97. So it's almost 20% expansion in the next decade, because they were anticipating this 30,000 new enrollments to happen. So another thing, so the money is clearly an issue, so the money has to come from somewhere. But another thing is that in the 50s, there was a change of paradigm in the construction of libraries in Australia by the looks of it. Because before then, when the library was constructed, the librarians were not consulted. There was, I believe, probably not even professional librarians back then when the first library, Fisher Library, was constructed in the beginning of 20th century. But at the turn of the century, not at the turn, at the middle of the century, 1950s, there are professional librarians, and there's a tendency to get them involved into the planning of the building. It started happening overseas first, and Australia was lagging behind. And there was a report in the 1930s saying that libraries in Australia are just lagging behind the rest of the world. And academics and librarians started traveling from Australia to the US, primarily to learn. The university centers started headhunting people to bring them to Australia to develop librarianship. So there's a new era when it comes to construction of libraries as well. So there were two issues to resolve in the 1950s for the university: money and who is going to contribute to the development of this building, because the library leadership at that point was in a bit of a flux. The current librarian, Edward Steele, was planning to retire in 1959. There were a few years still, but the Senate was looking for a successor. And they were looking high and low. They were advertising going out 54, 55. There was no suitable candidate available. And I guess when I was reading it first without realizing the full context, I couldn't understand what constitutes a suitable candidate. Because one of them, for example, was John Metcalf, who was the public library's principal librarian. And he was employed by the university as a deputy librarian for a year, for 6 months, to create a report on the library facilities that actually served as a foundation for the new building. So I then understood that what they were looking for is a person who could inform and propel the new building, the building of the library that sort of pushes the university into the new era. And they found a person like this in Andrew Osborne, whom they had hunted in. He was at the US at that time. He wasn't a university librarian. He was one of the associate librarians in Harvard University, and his boss, and that's where it gets confusing, Metcalf. That's another Metcalf. There are two Metcalfs there. One, the Australian one, who created the report, and one, the American one, who was Osborne's boss. That American librarian, the Harvard librarian, was consulting widely on library construction. And he actually came over to Australia in 1958 and was very closely involved at the early stages with Omani.
Yeah.
Omani. Involved with Omani and other architects on how the library should look like and what it should be doing functionally. So Osborne came to Australia to start in his role first as associate librarian in late 58, and from then on the work sort of propelled forward. So his arrival, he started consulting and working on the project from the United States when he was already there, because Omani went there in the first half of 58 to tour the country, to see the libraries. He consulted with Metcalf, he consulted with Osborne. So there was a lot.
He was Australian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What did I say?
Oh no, you didn't mention that. He was originally from Australia.
I'm so sorry. No, he was.
So could you just repeat what?
Oh, Andrew Osborne was originally Australian. He left Melbourne University in the mid-1920s to go and study in America.
I'm so sorry. I probably created an impression that he wasn't. No. And I guess that was, in his view, he's giving back to the country that he originated from, and also contributing to the sort of the love of his life, which is, the libraries and the university libraries in particular. So Andrew Osborne is, of course, one of the names that comes to mind.
Are you able to identify people already in post in the university who were active about the recruitment process? You've spoken about the people who were brought in. Who was already here? Who was out and about looking?
One name that I consistently come across when I read documents of that time is Harold Mays, and he was deputy principal. And he was very actively involved in library committees as well, but also the architects. I guess he was like a link between the library and the architects as well. So the architects consulted with him a lot.
There's a photo of him somewhere.
Really? Where?
Is there? Yes.
Far
Thanks, Neil.
right.
Yes, on this end, 3 along from the ladder. And Mays Crescent, for those of you who know the university, is named after him. He was a very powerful, would we say, Neil? Yes.
He had his enemies, they needed to be listened to.
Yes. there's the snapshot. Thank you. I want to ask Sebastian next. Is it true that Fisher Library was the first library in Australia to offer photocopying as a service? So we get into true and false.
Yeah. The simple answer would be no, but I think that would be.
Let's have it.
So
This is
I
a
think-
university. Come on.
I think at that time we wouldn't have called it photocopying. I think it was called Xeroxing, because that's the
Xerox,
company
yeah.
that came up with the first devices. Anyway, I wouldn't go too far there. Why they were not by the so it was a very cheap way of making black and white copies of original materials. I think Melbourne Uni beats University of Sydney for student services just by a few weeks or so. But University of Sydney had the first very innovative use of Xeroxing at the time. As we heard, like there was a big increase in the number of books coming into the library, and I think one of Osborne's mission was to increase the volume of material available to researchers and students. So he went out and bought all these different collections that then needed to be cataloged. But the cataloging was not just creating a record; it also means like you had these different card drawers, author, title, subject, one for the internal system, and then the Australian National Library was established. They want to have a copy of everything that the University of Sydney had as well, so that you have a national record, so Union Catalogue, I think it was called. So you had all these multiple copies of the same card. Now, instead of typing it out 4 or 5 times, they figured out, we can use the Xerox machine, copy these cards, and save a lot of typing work. And then they, of course, had to cut those cards. So there's pictures in the rare books collections of librarians with guillotines and with drills, doing very manual work, as you refer to create these copies of all these cards, to save a lot of labor in typing up all these cards. So that was the first innovative use to improve the efficiency of the library, you could say. And as I said, like later, they used.
Yes, one of the drawbacks was that over time the Xerox cards faded. Not all of them, but some of them. So it was a brilliant thing to do, but it had its drawbacks.
Julia mentioned collaboration between the architects and librarians, but apparently the architects refused to believe the number of people that would be coming through the main doors. So they installed these big, heavy doors that when I was here in the 70s, students were still complaining about.
Yep.
It was lovely to see the automatic doors now, but that took back. And another comment about stack, when that was first built, it was just raw concrete, as you can see in the photo, because the money ran out. There was no money to clad it. Then eventually it was clad with copper. And for the first couple of years, it was really bright copper. In fact, Oni Swire called it the largest Benson and Hedges package in the world. Which you have to be a certain age to understand that. And then eventually the copper sort of faded. And the university archives found that they had no official photographs of the stack building when it was bright copper. So they put out a request, does anyone have any photos of stack when it was that bright copper colour? I don't know whether they ever got them or not.
It was actually bronze.
Bronze. Yeah.
One year they somebody had the bright idea of using Brasso to do some graffiti on it.
I've heard that.
Yes.
Very clever.
Midday ball or something. It was there for years before it faded. Could I just say something about the photocopy?
I'm going to get Dr. Radford say. Yeah.
Before the Xerox machine was invented, which allowed the student to make his or her own photocopy, the university had a photography department in the attic of the corridor, and any academic in particular who wanted a copy of something would go up there and have it photographed and then charged to their department account, something like that. But there was a lot of photocopying going on before the Xerox machines came in the 1960, something like that.
There are students, of course, who don't believe that anyone ever took notes, but
yeah, I remember all of this, like many other people here. I remember the card catalogues for writing your PhD. But I'm really interested, there's been a knowledge explosion, and I'm really interested in how people see the future, because I think the idea of a human Google person is really necessary again in a way. And I also think that there's, as far as I can see, as a person who's lived in Glebe since 1973 and who remembers what books cost from the government bookshop, and I was an avid government bookshop reader, and all my money went on government reports at the government bookshop. Now I just get any government report for free by Googling in the right title of the report. I want to know how you see, particularly the people who really understand the new technology, how we are actually going to preserve books, because they tell me you're not going to read a book anymore. Rubbish. Rubbish. I've been telling that rubbish since 1990 and it's still rubbish. What's happened is books have produced and produced. I can't walk outside my front door without tripping over books in the gutters and on the pavements, and there's little bookshops all around Glebe, and we all go and, you know, put our books in the little bookshops. You have your yearly book sale. I want to know what happens to those books. Are they all pulped? Are they all destroyed? I think knowledge should be free, and I'm sick of going to places where people are dying and scratching for knowledge, and at least if they had a book, they could sell it. I want to know how the past and the future are expected to coordinate effectively in the interests of those people who are poorest, because when I did my education, I didn't go into massive debt to do it, so that I could no longer afford to live anywhere and I was no longer going to have a decent job. So basically, on behalf of any young people now and any poor people, I want to know how they all fit together, because I'm sick to death of the iPhone mentality.
I think I can extend a little bit further. That what I'm worried about is, now that we have lots of electronic copies of government reports and so on, how do we make sure that these records stay intact and as they are? Because nowadays we can go back and fudge a report that was printed, it's going into the archive, it can't be easily manipulated and changed. And I think nowadays we have to think, how can we make sure that these electronic records stay as they were created?
That's a secondary problem.
No, it's a major problem.
No, it's the one the boys
excuse
have
me.
picked up because they like security.
Katie, meanwhile, has been waiting to. Do you remember what it was?
That was about photocopying. I think it's gone now.
It's got to be.
I remember our first photocopying person, Fairy Owl, who ruled the photocopying area with a rod of iron. She was loud, she was dramatic, she was beautiful, and everybody loved her, but she hated those machines. But photocopying, the proliferation of photocopying gave rise to a new way of education, I think, of teaching people, because what it allowed was the photocopying of multiple copies of journal articles that academic staff thought were useful, and the development and the provision of the closed reserve. And that was a big part of the library when I was here.
Could you perhaps elaborate on part of that? How did the separation of the undergraduate and the research wings work in practice?
When I was first asked that question, my thoughts immediately went to the shelvers. And they were divided into the undergraduate shelvers and the research library shelvers, and it was quite hierarchical. The undergraduate shelvers had very many copies of books to shelve, so a trolley might have 5 or 6 titles on it, whereas the research library shelvers usually only had 1 copy of each item, and it was much more detailed shelving. So they thought themselves a little step above. They also had all the folios and quartos to deal with, and the long cutter numbers and so forth. When I was here and during my time, there was still a research library desk, a stack request desk. So people would have to come and ask for the books that they wanted. They had to fill out one of those for every book that they wanted. One of those as a souvenir. So they'd have to fill out a handful of these, and they would they'd be folded up and go into a little pneumatic tube, and they were pushed up to the right library floor, whereupon a shelver would go and gather the books, write on this if they couldn't find it, not on shelf, on loan. I don't know how they ever checked that it was on loan. But anyway, so this is, please fill in from author or serials catalogue, not from subject catalogue, and hand in at service counter. So we on the desk would have to wait for the shelver on the appropriate floor, and they had separate floors that they specialised in, to gather the books and send them down in the little book lift. And you were down there on the desk waiting for these books to arrive, waiting. And there was a bit of a power struggle sometimes. And I remember at one stage getting off the desk and going up and berating Alex Afanasiev, who was an enormous Russian. I said, don't you ever do that to me again, because we were the ones that were dealing with the academic staff and the students who wanted the books, and he was sitting back taking his good time. He never did it to me again. But that's the big difference between the undergraduate and the stacks. The other big difference, of course, was that there were very few people in these stacks. There were mainly academic staff and people who had the much coveted stack pass, but there were lots of undergraduate seating and lots of people around. When you were on the reference desk, you were responsible for the building, and I was interested in the comments on the big heavy doors, because when you were rostered to open the library, I always had a G master key, so I had to open the doors or I had to close the doors at night when the library opened and closed. But we were also responsible for the behaviour of people in the library. So if there were disturbances, we would be called, and sometimes these disturbances might be serious and we'd have to call medical staff, and sometimes they were just annoyances. One in particular that I remember was somebody came down and said, they'd front up to the reference desk and said, the noise is driving me mad. What noise? The chickens. I said, chickens? What do you mean the chickens? There's chirping in the library. And I went and looked, and all of the Psych 1 students had been assigned a task to imprint baby chicks. They were not allowed to let those chicks out of their sight, and they were chirping everywhere. Not much I could do. But yes, that was the main difference, I think, between the multiple copies, the number of the multiple people, and the shelving staff.
Your comment about not knowing how people commenting on the forms, would say on loan, puts me in mind of what's perhaps an apocryphal story about the British Library, where I spent some of my postgraduate years. And this was someone had put in the equivalent slip asking for a book published in 1954 and got back the standard reply, destroyed by enemy action. Was the end. Matt,
Well, the other great thing about the research library is if you had a pass to it, you actually looked at the shelves.
Yes.
And you would find all sorts of
Exactly.
things that you might not have found.
Exactly. Yes.
Well, I was just going to say, I started university in '86, and the stack was scary at night, and it had the lights that only went on for a period of time, and you
had to keep moving.
You had to keep moving, and well, I think in one instance, I think there were those buttons that slowly come out, and they would go off, and you'd want to make sure that you were not in a dark area, because it seemed an awful long way back to the centre.
What I was wanting to to ask you was, did the respective architects, are there particular parts of the library design that are attributable to particular?
Yes, it's interesting. Of course, we really only know Omani's side of the story, because he's the one who wrote about his involvement. Omani talked about the fact that he came up with the solution of two very distinct forms, one being more horizontal, one being more vertical. And then Ken Woolley adapted that further to spread them further apart with the lower bit in between. Omani claimed that he did the elevations of the building, which, as I said, with the undergraduate having the overhanging concrete slabs, which really emphasizes the horizontality of it, and then the beautiful bronze cladding on the stack, which is very vertical. So I think they're very distinctive components that Omani's probably very responsible for. During construction, there was a number of details were revised, and they're most likely attributable to Ken Woolley. I think probably things like the detail on the stairs, the glass mosaic tiles, the solid timber handrails, and some of the sort of the cabinetry. Ken Woolley did have the idea of the central atrium in the middle part of the building. It's hard to sort of to be able to identify. There are quite a few features in this building that became particularly notable in Ken Woolley's later work. So I think some of those things are, unless he adopted something that Omani had suggested. It's not entirely clear. And when everyone was attributing the whole project to Ken Woolley, he never said no. Even though it's very clear that they worked. They both had responsibility and involvement.
Matt, do you recognise the architects in this?
Yeah, we did that earlier. So this is Omani, and this is Ken Woolley. And Ken Woolley he was probably mid-20s at this stage. He was very young. He was one of the government architects branch was very much a fantastic training ground for architects, and they used to take on cadets who would go there when they started university, and there might be, say, 5 cadets, and they would get like 500 applicants for these cadet positions. So they were highly coveted, and the cadets basically were there from when they started university and then were committed to stay for a few years, often they would actually go away for a few years to do some study or travel international and then come back and continue working. Ken Woolley stayed at the Government Architects branch until about 64 or so, when he went and set up his own practice.
Who was responsible for the lino?
I'm pretty sure that would be Omani.
What about the pipes in the ladies' toilets that were?
Oh my God.
You could plead innocent.
I don't know anything about the pipes in the ladies'
Light the stiletto heels off.
Can I just touch while you're on that photograph?
Yeah.
The symbolism or purpose of the ladder.
Oh, that, yes.
Oh, I'm pretty sure it's like, no, to prove it's under construction. Piles of brick.
Carefully placed.
Yes.
Do we know who the woman is in the photo?
Yes, this is B.
Oh, yes.
B. Wines, and she was the interim. Sorry.
Someone's wanting to tell us exactly who he was.
Suggestion box. And the university librarian, first of all, Harrison Ford, then Neil Radford.
Harrison Bra.
A lot of questions, and Neil eventually moved the suggestion box from floor 3 down to floor 1 so that hardly anyone would find it. But one of the questions, which is quite funny in relation today, was the students would constantly complain there were only 2 public phones in the building. And why can't we get more public phones in the building for students to use? And Harrison Ford would reply.
Harrison Bra.
Right. Oh, Harrison. Harrison Bryant would say, I don't think it's the purpose of the library to provide public phones. Well, you know, of course, circumstances have overtaken that. But it was a constant complaint from the students.
Is there someone who can, Neil, I'm sure you can,
Sorry.
a brief biographical sketch of Beatrice Wines?
Oh,
She was, well, she was a deputy.
She joined the library staff in the 1920s, and I'm sorry, I don't know when, junior staff, and worked her way up to be deputy librarian. She was in charge of reader services, which wasn't called that then, it was something, some euphemism like that. It was the reading group. She was in charge of the reading group in college for a very long time, and came to be kind of symbolic of the librarian and the library. You know, I'll be Wines, you know, yes. Know about that. Or did you ask B. Wines? Yes. She knows all about it. She was very knowledgeable about the library, but she wasn't perfect. And I think she had a difficult time with Dr. Osborne, who was the man on the right. He was somebody with very firm ideas about where the library needed to go. And Beatrice she represented the past, and Andrew liked to think he represented the future. And he had some difficulty adjusting to that. The previous librarians under whom she had worked, Mr. Steele and Mr. Green, were her heroes. And she knew all about them, she knew their systems, she knew what they preferred and why and so forth. And she found it very difficult to have Andrew Osborne then come in and change everything. Because the library, until he came, had been very inwardly. And she was used to that, but it's not a criticism of hers, but yes, that it was inwardly. And Andrew was outwardly, because he'd been at Harvard for very many years, the largest university library in the world, I think. And he had a different idea about how libraries ought to be run. And he wasn't without his faults, but he made it difficult for Miss Wines, I think.
This is a truly historic photograph. It is.
Yes.
Ladder or no ladder.
Could I add a little something about Miss Wines and her closeness to some of the academic staff? When I first started in the Fisher Library in McLaurin Hall in 1959, I fairly soon began to work in the serials department, as it then was. And one of our duties every Friday afternoon was to take a select collection of journals to Professor Roberts, the Vice Chancellor at the time. And his favourite reading matter appeared to be the airmail edition of Life, magazines like Connoisseur, and such things. And
Things
so,
with illustration.
and if the airmail edition of Life had not arrived, Miss Wines would be down creating all hell for the staff.
You realise what you girls did? you robbed the Vice Chancellor of his favourite reading matter.
That's very interesting later on when Professor Roberts died, and some of us had to go and clear out his office. We found a missing volume of the Library of Congress catalogue, which had been missing for many years, and it was the volume that contained
That is true, because there was one volume in the set of the Library of Congress catalogues that was bound in a different colour. And I could never understand why. But then the right colour came back.
Wonderful. Leo.
And just a comment about needing to give Professor Roberts his weekly reading matter. Soon after I joined the staff in 1959, B. Wines came up to me and said, quick, you have to go to the newsagent down near Grace Brothers department store and buy whatever the magazine was that hadn't turned up for that Friday afternoon. And buy a copy and bring it back, give it to me, and we'll send it off. And she gave me the money, whatever it cost. There were some coins, and I was down to the newsagent, picked whatever it was, paid for the back in. Oh, thank you. Oh, you've saved our bacon, she said. He was a powerful man at university, but as you said before, he didn't always return things.
Well, just as the holy nun might have taken a vow of obedience, but she clearly hadn't taken one of obedience.
No.
Make a comment on the nun thing that somebody said. One day I was on duty at the horseshoe desk, the desk just inside the front door. And it was a day when the library had announced that that day would be a day when people could return overdue books, stolen books, or anything like that, no questions asked. If we wanted to get the books back. And I was on duty at the desk at the front door, and a nun came in. She's full out. And she said, "Excuse me, is this the day when the
amnesty is?"
And I said, "Yes, it is." And immediately from underneath she produced 2 big piles of books done up in a row and put them on the desk. And said, "Thank you," and went out. So we looked them up and they were all stolen. She was from Santa Sophia College and the students had stolen them.
Infinitely doubt. Goodness me.
I remember nagging a member of staff once for a book that he had out online officially. Didn't have it. And then one time, I forget what, we were in his office and there it was. No, he was there, that's right. And he said, "Oh, look, here, have my copy." Guess what?
The name of Fisher is really taken in vain all too often.
Does policy now? Like, is there an overall kind of overarching policy, futuristic kind of development for library services at Sydney University and globally? I mean, as it interacts with work.
So we have a new strategy for the library, which was endorsed by the executive and the academic board just in the last few months, and it's on our website.
What's it called? Strategy?
The library strategy, and it's a 10-year strategy.
How did Fisher Library then, in the 60 years, that compare with other university libraries?
I would like to say that the Sydney University Library was the first university library built and heralded the way to other university libraries, but that's not true. Melbourne beat us again, as with xerography. So the Value Library was built in 59 and Fisher was opened in 63. So, but there's clearly a tendency starting in from mid-50s and throughout that period, and there were like 25 libraries, university libraries, built in the next decade and a half. So it was the beginning of a new era for the university libraries, and much of it was facilitated by the Murray's money, as they called it. There was I can never remember what it is. Murray's committee. Oh my God. Committee of Inquiry into the Future of Australian Universities, led by
Mr. Murray.
Mr. Murray. And this is how the, I'm not quite sure about value. The timing is not quite right. So I'm not sure if it was funded by the same committee or by the, no, probably not. The timing is not right. But the University Sydney Library, Fisher Library, was funded by the money that the university sort of submitted the request, and the government, the state government and the Commonwealth government shared half the expense, and the library was built. So it was the new era. The government was interested in supporting universities. The government was interested in supporting libraries. The government was interested in supporting universities, and universities understood the importance of libraries, let's put it that way, in a different way they understood it before. So if we look at value and look at Fisher, because they are sort of comparable size universities and built in approximately the same time, we can see that value had some of the ideas that were implemented in Fisher as well. They were just a little bit more conservative at scale. And I'm not sure why that happened. Is it the funding? Is it the vision of the architects? But the value turned out, when it was built, it became overcrowded pretty quickly. In a few years, the students started complaining and doing sit-ins. There was not enough space. There was not enough books. When Fisher was built, just 4 years after, the scale of it was much greater, and the capacity to expand was much greater. So we clearly see the difference there as well. But both libraries heralded this new approach when librarians were consulted, when the buildings were built. It was not the case before. And although at the University of Sydney, Senate was very well aware that by delaying the construction of the library, they are making, students more inconvenient, the student life more inconvenience, and, they're getting themselves into trouble, but they still were looking for the right person to be in charge and to spearhead this development. They wanted to start very early in 1955, but they couldn't until they found the right person to collaborate with the architects. So yeah, there are Fisher became sort of the stylistic icon for many libraries as well, and I think Matt could talk to it in greater detail. But Bellew sort of started this whole new era of the new library for the new university in the new time and space.
I'm going to ask Sebastian about the extent to which, what were the technological advances that were important for Fisher in the 60s.
Yeah. I think we heard it referred to before, that there was this noisy new room with all this very big machinery, and that had to do with that there's this increasing student body that found it also perhaps then more convenient to borrow books. So at the time, as I said, like there were no computer. The university had a computer, Celiac, but really
a computer,
big mainframe computers. Very heavy. Australian had one of the very first one. It was on the University of Sydney ground, but it was not from the University of Sydney, from CSIRO. I think at that time it was not. Anyway, that's beside the point. So in the library, you had all these loans, and you need to process them. And the idea came from the US, from the Brooklyn City Library, how to manage all these loans. And you refer to these different transaction cards with the numbers. And that was the big advancement at the time, that there was a dedicated room for all these machines. So you had a machine to put holes into these cards so you can sort them. You had a sorting machine, then you had a collating machine that you can mix these decks of cards. And that was the big technological advancement at the time, that you could then track a much higher student or much higher loan volume in time. And it ties then in with overdue loans that you could perhaps enforce more easily. And then when these loans were increased in fines in 67, you had all these protesting students that had also sit-ins. I guess it was the vibe of the time. Sit-ins. But partially because you had this mechanical sorting, that you could really easily track overdue loans. At that time, this machine was quite expensive. It cost as much as a staff salary. So you had this installation, it cost as much as you would pay a whole person for a whole year. But the idea was it saves 3 staff members that actually would then do all these forms. So that was, and it led the way into computerization. Once you had these machines, you could punch holes in, you can sort them mechanically. You can feed this into a computer, and then can sort it for you. That's how the undergraduate library catalog came about. Too many students in front of these shelves, not enough space, all the staff members that need to sort in the new cards, all the researchers that want to use that. So they talked about congestion. How to get rid of this congestion? Well, you print a book. In this book has all the items that are in the undergraduate library, and then now students can consult the holdings in the undergraduate library, not contributing further to this congestion item. So that was the foundation for that late in this mechanical data processing in this punch cards. And when you said like chasing after the numbers, why was it important? Because it was the anti-theft measure, right? The number that is stamped in the back of the book and the card that you gave them had to be the same, because otherwise I could go to the library, take any of those cards from the books that I already borrowed, slip in the back of my book, come to the horseshoe desk, walk out of it, and effectively stole a book. And that's why these numbers had to match up, so that the number that was stamped in the book and the number that was in the card that the librarian put into the book were the same. Yeah.
I'd like to say a word about the catalogue. I mean, when the computer printed cards were produced, that was a brilliant technology in its day, because you could update it, insert things anywhere you liked in it if you have multiple entries in it. And there just wasn't the computing power to handle it online. That was about 10 years later.
Yeah, there was several stages. First, the undergraduate library only, because it had far fewer books.
Uppercase, one title a line.
Exactly.
And somebody had to take it over to the computing centre, all the cards, and wait there while it got printed.
So twice a year.
Things went wrong with it every time. One cards got merged, and then one time they printed it with ink that ran when the printer tried to print it. Another time they tried to merge the undergraduate library with the new catalogue records, and they didn't sort properly.
They ran on two different computer systems. So the university administration and the physics department both had computers.
Yeah.
They were not one.
Yeah,
They were not one.
Professor John Bennett was
Yes.
very much in there.
But they were, one was used for the undergraduate library and the other one was used for the bibliographic, machine readable bibliographic catalog. So they ran on different computer systems. As you said, like the one for the undergraduate library had.
The bibliographic one is much more detailed.
Yeah, exactly. It had very limited.
We insisted on upper and lower case. and accents.
Goodness, I never thought of punch cards, just going back a step, as having the poetry.
They did.
What was the most exciting thing? You talked about your job as being exciting various times. What was the most exciting?
The times were exciting. Anywhere that's as big as this place with all of these books and with the number of ideas that were going on. But the 70s were an exciting time socially. There were a lot of there were a lot of sit-ins. There was a lot of student activity. Young people were really finding their voice in those days, and they were shouting loudly, I think. There were lots of ups and downs, and I do remember one time bomb scares became very prevalent. And the first bomb scare that we had, I was still in the circulation department, and the announcement went over that a bomb was planted in the library, and we all rushed outside to the front, including Jean Primrose White. And she was the deputy librarian in those days, a large, imposing woman, and she had a big box with her, and she had rescued I think there must have been magnetic tape of the first digitisation of the catalogue. Do you remember this, Enid?
No, I don't know.
No. So I remember somebody said there's Jean White, and what she rescued was the first digitisation of the catalogue. It wasn't complete, but it was there. But yeah, everything.
I remember the first catalogue cards that were finally successful, and Andrea brought them to morning tea, a little bundle like this of finally successful computer printed cards. And I said to her, how much do you think those cost? And she said, oh, $30,000.
For me, the most exciting thing was the introduction of online searching, which happened mid-70s sometime.
Did you bring up California and got some man out of bed?
We did, yeah. We had a little machine that looked like that dumb terminal at the back there that took characters at 30 characters a second, which you could read at, and it didn't have a printer, so that if you were doing a search for somebody, they would have to write notes for it. We had some money. Neil said, we've got some money left over from an accounting error, and we can't spend it on staff and we can't spend it on books. Do you think you can spend it? Well, yeah, we thought we could. So we offered online searching. So in those days, there was no telecommunications. It was all done through telephone voice line calls. And as Enid said, tremblingly, you'd ring up this very long number, an American number, and the first time we did it, somebody answered. And it was an American man we'd gotten out of bed, and we said, "Have you got a Lockheed computer?" He said it wasn't. And so we tried again. But it was tremendously exciting to be able to do stuff with those printed indexes and abstracts that for academic staff that we'd never been able to do anything like it before. And I did a search for a senior lecturer in the Department of Government on the Social Sciences Citation Index. And this was something quite unusual. The citation indexes themselves were different, a different methodology for searching the literature. And what he wanted was to find anybody who had cited, all articles who had cited the philosopher John Rawls. And we could do that. And Michael must have been happy with the results because we're still married.
Judith.
Margaret, could I just just make a comment on the impact that the opening of New Fisher had on the students.
Yes.
Because my first year as an art student was in Old Fisher. And you had the feeling as an undergraduate that you were definitely a second-class citizen. The place was a shambles because it was just too much work for the staff, obviously, to keep things in order. We were limited as to where we could go. We couldn't get access to the books because there weren't enough copies, and Andrew Osborne had built an annex across on the other side of the stairway. I don't know if any of you remember that, where the multiple copies were. We went home for the for the university holidays. We came back the next year, and there was Fisher, and it was like living in luxury for an undergraduate student. There was space, there was light, you could get access to the books because the multiple copies were there on the multicoloured shelves, and you could do your homework with your earphones on in the music listening area, catching up on the classical music that you didn't have the money to buy for yourself. Wow. And it really made a huge difference to the life of undergraduate students.
During the Vietnam War demonstration, I think it was Michael Mansell was on campus, and he was about to be arrested by police, real police, not campus police. And a student raced over to the library and asked who was on the duty at the reference desk, no, it would have been the research library desk, to use the microphone, and he broadcast, Michael Mansell's about to be arrested on the front lawn. And within a couple of minutes, about 1,000 students streamed out of the library, raced over and surrounded him and stopped his arrest.
Can you just say who he was? He was a, well, it was a, was he a conscientious objector to the conscientious objector? Yeah.
Michael Mansell. They used bulk cutters.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
Went down to engineering. They got bulk cutters and they released him from the handcuffs.
But the students coming from the library would stop the police taking him into the police car and out the front gate.
And also many of the staff, me included, left their desks, went up onto floor 5 to be observers, to watch actually what was happening, because, you know, quite often police reports were not exactly as good. And so quite a few of us lined up there to actually observe what was happening on the front lawn.
On the front lawn, indeed. Are there any other comments, war stories, questions?
I'd like a war story, if I may. I set up a library. I went to Nigeria straight from university and set up a library that had been closed. It was the US Information Library. They kicked out the Peace Corps and closed the library while the war was on, and I had to open it up and start it up. And I bought about 100 copies, or the school did, about 100 copies of the African Writers Penguin series. And they all got stolen in about 10 minutes. Well, that's an exaggeration, but they all got stolen. And it was because the boys had caftans, and they would, unless you actually patted down the boys with the caftan, because only the boys were getting an education, and they were important boys, you couldn't pat down the caftans. So all the library books got stolen very quickly. And I always remember, I look back and I remember what I knew about libraries and about living in desert country then. And I look at the world now and I think, well, geez, that wasn't very well managed, was it?
There's a moral, isn't there, to caftans and nuns' hats?
Yep, no bulky clothing allowed.
Not just heels and bulky clothes.
An architecture question. I'm just interested in what characteristics make a library different to a normal building. Like what key considerations are there? Obviously, you have to have room for expansion for a library like this, but also maybe tremendous floor loading. But are there other things that you would need to think about in terms of a library rather than a normal building?
I suppose it kind of just comes down to sort of when you're doing a plan for a building, you need to think about way things move, and and in the case of a library, where things are stored, where they travel to, where they leave. They're just sort of basic planning principles. In a library, as you said, there would certainly loading is a serious issue, because books, lots of books are very heavy, and just a lesson for anyone: if you have a big bookcase at home, and preferably up against a wall, and ideally have a wall underneath it as well, just in terms of how heavy books are. So the sort of basic sort of understanding of processes and systems really is kind of what it's about. And any building has a similar sort of issue. Any sort of large complex building has it's kind of similar to a factory in some ways. It's about the processes that then inform the layout.
Can I add something here? With Fisher in particular, the very important focus was the traffic of students. So if you can see that the Fisher starts at level 3, the main entrance is at level 3, and the entrance is flat. So that's a welcoming feel for everyone to walk in. And as students walk in, they have unobstructed way of moving sideways, and up and down in equal measure. So it's 2 floors down, 2 floors up. So that was by design. And also at that time, because philosophy informed the building in a sense that the library was moving and sort of turning its face towards a student, an individual. They wanted to make a student welcome, and they wanted to make them comfortable and support them in their studies. So a lot of it was about movement, but also furniture, but also sectioning of the building. Some sections needed to be quiet, some sections needed to be noisy, some sections for mingling, some sections for individual work. And the furniture reflected that as well, because they came up with an idea of carrels when students are sitting separated from one another. And they wanted to prevent librarians from unpleasant work of walking around and shushing people. So they basically wanted to design a building that will itself promote certain behaviors by furniture, by design, by space itself.
Would it then be the consensus of the panel, this is asking a lot, to say that the building that was opened 60 years ago was fit for purpose then and remains fit for purpose now? We'll just go along the road.
Yeah.
Not too long.
I suppose yes, one of the things about a good building is its adaptability. And so Fisher has been adaptable to changing library needs. There's a lot less books than there ever were, but there's a lot more capacity to get more information. So I suppose then it has been fit for purpose. I probably prefer if it was when I was here in the 80s, in that there was a lot more books. Because for me, it's the incidental discovery that is actually what I find is important about research, rather than knowing what you're looking for. You're going through that book on that spot, but these ones along here are going to be useful too. But yes, it has been. Yeah, I believe I'm saying yes in that it has adapted to contemporary library uses.
The adaptability.
Adaptability.
Is a really important one. Julia?
Yes, I'd say so, because yes, someone mentioned that Fisher went through quite a few renovations and sort of refurbishments ever since, but the gist, I think, remains the same. It is a central location. It is welcoming for students. It is a transparent building, and I think, and I don't remember where, but I read somewhere that the transparency of the building was one of its sort of main features and good features, because you can actually see what the building is for. Students are studying here, and I think this welcoming nature of it aged very well.
Sebastian?
I'm not sure I can speak too much to that. I would be interested in where the machine room was located, where the computers were located at the time when the library started to have its own computer here, which was surely not planned when the building was designed. But I think adaptability, seems to be what the library has been gone through, and I know that the part of the research library wing was available to many other departments for a very long time.
I don't know what to say about the building because knowledge has changed so much in the time that when I started it was all paper, it was all manual, and when I left it was almost all computerised, and now a member of academic staff or a researcher can sit at their desk and not come to the library at all. I think it must have been a very difficult time for libraries in general and librarians trying to make sense and find a role for themselves in the provision of information to those people who need it in a timely fashion and teaching those people how to get to the information that they need. That role doesn't depend on a building, and where the building fits in that, I'm really not sure.
Suppose that much.
The only thing is you can't get the archive materials very easily. It's supposed to be a system, but you can't easily get it because it's not big enough space.
When you say the archive material,
I don't know if that's the proper name for it, but the books that were here that have been put somewhere else.
The ones that are yes,
that's always been the case. The deposit libraries was still filled with books that couldn't fit in this library when I was here.
Very hard to get.
But I think your point, Sebastian, is quite a very valid one about the future of information and how solid a piece of paper is and how immutable it is, as opposed to the digital world, which is infinitely immutable.
Can I just say something? Because I came in Australia in 1970s, and when I visited the Sydney Uni, this building official did not look, with the rest of the Sydney that way. It looked odd to me at that time. That's how I felt. The architect was very modern. The Sydney Uni itself was poetical.
Yeah, and it was a time when it was an attempt to be as modern as possible. Yeah. It was think of only just a few years beforehand the chemistry building had been built, but most of the things up until World War II still had some sort of Gothic element.
Yeah.
So I don't know what's now called, but it was the Madsen building. And it was a 30s building, but sort of attempting to be vaguely Gothic. And suddenly, the 50s, we're trying to be as modern as possible.
And in this case, successfully.
Yes,
the chemistry building.
Chemistry
I
building.
think less so.
Well, I think the problem with the chemistry building is that it got all of the screens on some of the windows. It's actually a very beautiful building if you were able
We
to.
disagree on this with Matt.
Yeah, it's one of my favourites. My father still refers, well, he did until recently, referred to the new chemistry building because it was built while he was here.
You won't mention cars more.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
I was listening to the comments about is the building suitable, is it still suitable for purpose? About the sort of purpose of students coming together, coming somewhere to do work in the university. That work in the university was one of the drivers for change in the first site. What about it now? And what about visions that want to do in the future? Please, because I've been out of it for years.
Well, it's interesting. The subject I've been teaching this last semester, I teach in the Heritage Conservation Program in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning. And there's been group assignments. And the challenges of group assignments still continue, as they always have. At least two of my groups have imploded. But a lot of what they're doing is they're meeting virtually. No, they are all, no, classes are all face to face, so they are mostly were attending on a Tuesday morning with me for 4 hours, which was at least a time that they could have a real meeting before or after. But I know a lot of them just were Teams meetings, Zoom meetings, Google Drives for shared information. It's very different to actually booking a room and working around a table for a day or so.
But that provision for in-person meetings is still in the library.
Yes, and I was also thinking, well, I mightn't have said this, students by themselves, I was just having a little walk around before this, and there are students in here working. Is that valid still? Is that too expensive per head to have that sort of thing when they can go home and do it on their own machines?
Well, not all of them can.
No,
Yes.
I mean, I'm not saying they're homeless, but their circumstances aren't.
If you go to the Mitchell wing of the State Library at the moment, it is full of students, well, has been full of students studying for the HSC. And so it's still, libraries are still a place to go to study. You can, internet access, most people have their own computers now, but not everyone, so you could still book a computer, those sorts of things. So libraries are still a place where people go to study and research, even if it's only for really good internet access.
Or air conditioning.
Air conditioning, yeah.
Actually, if you hear the state librarian talk, the HSC students go to meet each other after school hours. I mean, socialise and meet new people.
Oh, yeah.
I think, vigorous waving from the back. Quick questions, please.
I'll stand up because I can't see it.
Oh.
And I'd like to see people. Just a couple of observations. Sydney was incredibly lucky to get the building that it got. It might have got a building like New South Wales or Newcastle or Wollongong, that brutal, well, dare I say it, Macquarie, those brutalist type buildings that push down on you rather than lift you up. And the sight of Fisher undergraduate at night is just magnificent. When I was here, I had two favourite times of the year, of the day rather. One was in the morning. I parked up near the quadrangle and I'd walk through the quad. The Carillionist was tinkling away because she wasn't allowed to play at full force because people in Glebe protested. The Currawongs were chirping. And then at night time, when I walked back, I'd get to the arch and turn back to the library and see it there in all of its magnificence. The other thing is that when we were doing the refurbishment before this one, when Wilcox did a little cartoon in the Herald claiming that I was throwing out the last Gutenberg, and various members of the humanities faculty took absolute objection to my suggestion that we had the dust test where we wiped our fingers along the tops of books to determine whether or not they were used, and gave storage or not, all of that part. One of the things that I pushed with the Vice-Chancellor at the time was that some students need a place to work. Not every student has an ideal home life where it's quiet, where it's air conditioning, and so forth. I used to work until fairly late, and we had a coffee cart out in front of the building. And I went out there one night to get a coffee, and there was a young Muslim student in front of me. And I shouldn't have accosted a young student, but I did. And I said to her, "What are you studying?" And she said, "And why are you here?" And she said, "Well, see that car over there?" She said, "That's my father. He's sitting out there to make sure I don't leave the library." What he doesn't know is that all of the Muslim engineering students are down on level 1 and we're all together. There's a need for libraries and it will continue. It's just a different need. And that was one of the things that why we cleaned out the stack to some extent, was to make it more habitable, because it was a scary place. We did have assaults up there. I wasn't here very long before somebody came down one night and said, they're fornicating in the shelves on level 9. And I thought, what do I do? I can't go up and join them. It's not on. But we sent the shelfer up there. But to make the place more habitable, but we are very lucky. And as we consulted with the architect at the time of the changes, and he was antagonistic to some of the changes. But the building has good bones, as they say, and except for having to put in some better air conditioning and more lifts in the stack, it's served us well for so long. So I think we've got a great deal of appreciation to give to the early architects and to Andrew Osborne for his sheer tenacity, even though he was a bit objectionable sometimes. I only met him twice, both in old age.
Thanks, Joe. I think time's up. I thank the panel. I thank you all. And Philip is going to thank us all again.
Thank you very much to Margaret for chairing this session. We're so grateful to her to come and do this, and also to our 4 speakers who have lots more information, I'm sure, in here that we didn't have enough time to do justice to all the amazing stories and information. But also thank you to you, the audience, for your contributions, your memories. It's great to have so many former staff back and to contribute to today. As you probably picked up, today we have 2 of my predecessors here. We have Dr Neil Radford, who was a former university librarian, and we have John Shipp. We did try to have the family of Andrew Osborne here. His son, Andrew Jr., is still alive in Tasmania, and his other son, Frank, is living in the United States. They're coming to visit us in March next year, so it's great to have that connection. But we're grateful that Kerry Roberts, who is a cousin from the Osborne family, is here today as well. Through Neil, we have reached out to the family of Harrison Bryan. Harrison Bryan, not Harrison Ford. We have made contact with members of the family, but no one was able to be here today. So it's been a lovely session, and we also send our regards to our colleagues in the other room, because one of the things, if I have my time over again with this building, we need larger space for people to come together. But I really do agree with John and members of the panel. Having been the university librarian at Melbourne in the past and working with the Baillieu, it may have taken a little bit longer, but the University of Sydney, I think, got better bones. And I think ultimately too, although both buildings are still working very hard with much larger student bodies and collections, I think the other interesting point of comparison is that the first Fisher Library worked for 54 years, and this building has already worked for 60. And I think it, as we've said, still has a good life ahead. So thank you all very much to the panel for leading the conversation and sharing your information with us, but also to stirring the juices of the audience to contribute today. I would also like to acknowledge, as well as my 2 predecessors that are here today, and the Friends of the Library Committee, and Ross Coleman, who is also a former member of staff, is the chair of that committee. And as I said earlier, Margaret is a member of that committee, and we're delighted to have other members of the Friends Committee in the audience today as well. And so thank you all very much. There are more activities going on for the rest of the day. I imagine that many of you have booked to come to the roof, to the cake cutting. Unfortunately, we're only, because of the fire escapes, etc., we only are allowed to have 100 people on the roof at a time, which is why we have multiple sessions. But it's also been amazing. We unfortunately had a waiting list of nearly 100 people for those sessions on the roof. So we appreciate your generosity in attending for the time that you have already booked for, and please do enjoy the roof. It was anticipated that it would be finished earlier, but it's actually worked out really well that we are reopening the roof at the same time as we're celebrating the 60th anniversary of this amazing building. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to your company again in the future, and also for the rest of today, and for those that are staying for the function this evening as well. Thank you.
It's a bit confusing because it's Yulia Ulyannikova. Yeah,
That's what it is. Yeah.